Hello and welcome, you guys. Hello, and thank you for the support, especially if you're new. Thank you. I talk about plants and I just have a lot of fun with it. So today I'm going to be talking about this ginormous tree behind me. This here is a tulip tree. It's in the Magnoliaceae family, and I just thought that today would be a beautiful day to show you. So this here is the tree in its glory. It's absolutely ginormous. This one I'd say is at about 150 years old. It's a deciduous tree by nature. It's native to North America, particularly the Midwest and eastern coastal parts of the United States. And it's also the emblem tree of several states, I believe Indiana, Kentucky, and Tennessee. And those are the forests where these trees just really flourish and they make a huge statement. They're one of the largest deciduous trees native to North America. So, just this is a really interesting time of the year to show you guys some of its features because everything's kind of out right now. So this here is the leaf. This is the backside with its sort of pinnate venation. And then this here is the front side that has more netted venation. And it kind of, I feel like it looks almost like a cat, kind of. I don't know if you can see it, like a cat with really fat cheeks. That's just kind of how I identify the leaf shape. It's quite similar to an acer or like a maple, but it's in Magnoliaceae, so completely different family. So, in midsummer, right now we're in the beginning of June. This plant, or early summer into midsummer, right now we're in the beginning of June. It produces these really interesting blooms that I think are often overlooked. They have this really interesting peach kind of orangey um, modeling or pattern to each individual bract of the flower. And interestingly enough, the flowers themselves photosynthesize, which is really cool. So each individual flower is born with approximately 50 or so stamens. And they're really interesting because they have pollen going all the way up and down the stamens. And they look almost kind of like a sea anemone. It's just a really weird thing to describe. So each individual flower has two corollas, so two rings of about 4 different petals, giving you 8 petals all the way around. This here is what the individual bud looks like. It's just about an inch in length, and I think that's pretty cool. Sometimes these drop prematurely and they make for good food for squirrels and stuff like that. Another interesting thing about this plant, if I can find it, I just had a really good cone, but I dropped it earlier. It produces this really interesting compound seed structure that has a whole bunch, here it is, has a whole bunch of individual samaras. That's kind of its an anatomical seed structure. So it produces these, they dangle down on the plant, and eventually when they fall down with enough force from the top of the tree, they start to disintegrate. And then you get these individual samaras which fall down much like a helicopter. I don't know if you've ever played like a helicopter game with like the little seed pods of a maple tree, but this is very similar. It's aerodynamic. If you put this in warm water for a few weeks, it'll germinate for you. But germination rates are typically quite low. They're usually about 50 to 60%. So this is a long-lived tree. It can live upwards of 300 years easy, I would say. It's extremely tolerant, cold hardy to about negative 40 degrees Celsius. So this tree is really quite resilient. It's also quite drought tolerant once it's established. So this tree here can go a whole summer easy without any additional supplemental water, and it should fare just fine for you. So one thing I really want to mention about this tree is it has a huge root system. Pardon the mess here, we're just moving everything around. And in this root system, it creates these upheavals of soil. So if you have a small property like a really urbanized property or something like that, I don't recommend planting this if you don't want uneven, unleveled ground. When we moved in here, it was already here, so we just kind of welcomed this tree, and it's just a whimsical part of our landscape. But if you like a really leveled gradient in your lawn, highly do not recommend this tree. It's huge. Another thing I will say is it does tend to produce a lot of suckers. And another interesting thing about this tree that I think is quite common in large leaf deciduous trees is that the mature leaf shape is very different from the mature or from the juvenile leaf shape. So this here is just kind of the new growth bud of one individual sucker. And I don't know if you can see, it only has 3 main lobes and it's very large in comparison to the mature leaves. This here is a more established sucker. This one's been growing for about 3.5 years. And you can even notice just huge differences in the bark. This is mature wood, and then this here is juvenile wood. And it usually doesn't exfoliate, it usually stays really quite smooth for at least the first several seasons. And the leaves are much larger on the juvenile plants. So, I'll show you guys in comparison what the larger or the more mature, smaller leaves look like. Just for comparison, they're more pointy and a lot smaller. This here is a mature leaf. And I'll just show you guys the complete difference in shape. See what I mean? How like one's way rounder than the other one? I think this here is a really beautiful example here. Yeah, so that's just another ID feature of this tree. Now I'm going to talk about a few problems that people may encounter with this tree because I think it's important to mention that too. I think the biggest one is it doesn't respond very well to pruning, so I mean they can get absolutely ginormous really quite quickly. It's a fast-growing tree. It can grow 4 to 5 feet up, like on top of its canopy if you really let it once it's mature. And another thing about this tree is it's incredibly susceptible to aphids and the exuvia that the aphids leave behind. So in late summer, I think it's quite important to mention that it sheds quite a large deal of its leaves due to aphid infestations. So if you have a really formal garden, I don't recommend planting this tree anywhere where its leaves can just crowd everything out, because that happens. And another thing I really want to mention with this tree is when you're starting it out, it really doesn't like transplanting. It's quite susceptible to transplant shock, to just pythium of the roots, because the tree's already shocked, and then when you introduce it to a new soil environment, it just tends to dwindle off. And another thing that I will mention about this tree is the suckers. It grows suckers absolutely everywhere, so you want to avoid that in an area where you constantly mow over and it's really sort of aimed to be a more aesthetic garden. Another thing I want to mention about this tree is it does have quite a deal of limb dieback. So if you don't like twigs and stuff like that all over your yard, you probably shouldn't plant this tree either. Like, this is just the kind of stuff I mean, like just really spindly twigs that just end up everywhere. And if you have children or like someone who's more at risk of injury or whatever outside, there is a little bit of limb dieback on this tree too, especially as it gets older and matures. Now, if you want to do corrective pruning on this tree, I highly recommend that you get rid of elbow crotches and you get rid of branches that have an angle upwards of 45 degrees going towards the apex of the tree, because that leads to severe structural damage later on when the larger limbs rub up against each other, and then that poses a safety hazard. Another thing I wanted to mention about this tree is it is somewhat susceptible to chlorosis and magnesium deficiency. So just any way that you would remedy another shrub with that, like a top dressing of the soil or whatever, really helps this tree. And don't plant anything that you really care about if it likes high sun conditions underneath this tree, because it does shade out quite a bit. Now, some of the positives I would say of this tree are it's a wonderful shade tree. It's a beautiful cascading canopy. It has really interesting spring features. When the leaves first emerge, it's just a beautiful shade of yellowy chartreuse, and I think it's just quite a spectacle. It goes this really nice orangey yellow color into the fall, but this tree is messy. It's really hard to clean up after, especially if you have a relatively small yard and there's just leaves everywhere. So this here is the tree. I just wanted to give you guys some scale. This is about its mature width, but it can get even higher. It can go up to about 200 feet, which is just absolutely insane. And it has a mature width of a little bit more than half of that, so about 60 feet. So I just wanted to show you just how much of the yard this here takes up. Like, it's just ginormous. So that there is Liriodendron tulipifera, one of the beautiful, beautiful members of the Magnoliaceae family. And if you guys grow this, make sure you have a lot of space, more space than I have, because it just takes over. And yeah, what else do I want to say about it? By far the easiest way to propagate this tree is through clonal propagates on the bottom, like suckers and just little spurs that grow on the base of the tree. That's the easiest way. But that being said, germination is quite possible. Yeah, so I hope I taught you guys a little bit more about this beautiful tree, and just have a wonderful day. You guys deserve the best. Till next time.